Okay. Hi, I am Naomi Firestone Teeter. I'm the Executive Director of Jewish Book Council, and I'm very excited to welcome you to today's discussion with Ilana Masad, the third debut author that we've had the pleasure of featuring as a part of this series, JBC Authors at the Table. We're so appreciative of you joining us here each week to celebrate authors of recently released or forthcoming books. And I hope you will not only continue to join us for this weekly series, but also join us for our upcoming programs as a part of the Great Big Jewish Food Fest. You can find links to JBC's programs during the festival in the chat in a moment. JBC is also proud to be a co-sponsor of the upcoming Limud E-Festival of Ideas, and you can find a link to that as well in a moment. Before we begin, for those of you unfamiliar with Jewish Book Council is a nonprofit organization that educates and enriches the community through Jewish literature. We have a variety of programs and resources you can find on our website, including reviews, essays, author tours, awards, and book club guides. I hope you will check it out and that you might also consider becoming a member to support JBC's continued initiatives. You can find the link in the chat momentarily. Each week, a different member of JBC's team will be hosting our Authors at the Table conversation. And this week, I'm very pleased to introduce you to our program associate, Michelle Zarov, who will lead the discussion. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Naomi, and a huge thank you to Ilana Masad and everyone joining us today. Welcome to this week's JBC Authors at the Table. This is the fourth installment of our lunchtime series in which we introduce our readers to an author and their recently released book. We hope you'll continue to join us in the coming weeks and that you'll support our amazing authors by purchasing their books. You can find the link to Ilana's book in the chat. On the screen, you'll see the JBC staff, and we'll all be chiming in with questions during the conversation. If anyone in the audience would like to share your own questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Also, on the top right of your screen, you have the option to view the discussion in gallery or speaker mode. So please choose whichever one you prefer. With that being said, we are very excited to introduce Ilana Masad, who will be talking about her debut novel, All My Mother's Lovers, which I have right here. Ilana's book comes out on May 26th from Dun. Ilana Masad is a queer Israeli-American writer and book critic whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and other various publications. She is the founder and host of the Other Stories podcast and a doctoral student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she also serves as the assistant nonfiction editor for Prairie Schooner. All My Mother's Lovers is her debut novel. Welcome, Ilana. It's such a pleasure having you join us today. How are you doing during this quarantine?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to JBC and to this event. And I am holding up okay. I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska, so there's a little more space than in New York to sort of take walks, so that is good for my mental health right now.
That is definitely important. So to start us off, could you please tell us a bit about your book?
Absolutely. So All My Mother's Lovers is about a queer woman named Maggie, whose mother dies very unexpectedly. And Maggie goes back to California to sort of organize the funeral and Shiva, and discovers with her mother's will these 5 letters that her mother wanted sent out upon her death. And she's never heard of the men to whom these letters are addressed. And she decides to take a road trip and hand deliver these letters as a kind of way of avoiding the Shiva and her grief. And the title, it's not really a spoiler to say that she discovers some things about her mother and her parents' marriage that she wasn't expecting to discover.
I mean, the plot is so riveting and the characters are so inspiring. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, it started really with a line. So the first line of the book is just sort of came to me in the middle of the night. And that, there's a million lines that come to writers all the time, and to many of us in the middle of the night. Most of them we just don't remember the next morning. If you, like me, are lazy and don't like to get up and actually write those lines down, which I almost never do. And I didn't write this line down. I just couldn't sleep, and I kept sort of turning that line over and over in my head, and I happened to remember it the next morning. And so I kept thinking about it, and it led me to getting to know these characters. And so the characters really brought the plot to me from that line, from that idea of this queer woman whose mother had just died.
Can I ask what the line was?
Oh, yes, but I don't want to butcher it, so I want to just make sure, because it's basically the line that is still the first line of the book, which is, Maggie is in the midst of a second lazy orgasm when her brother, Ariel, calls to tell her their mother has died. The name of the brother wasn't there yet, but other than his name, that line was basically what I turned over and over and over in my head that night.
So before we jump into the conversation, could you please read a passage to give our readers a taste of your book?
Absolutely. So this is still quite early in the book, but Maggie has gotten home after leaving St. Louis, where she lives, and she's seen that her father, whose name is Peter, I'm not sure if it's mentioned here, no, I don't think so, but her father is sort of not dealing very well with her mother Iris's death. Maggie sits in her childhood bedroom for a moment, on the single bed her parents never agreed to graduate her out of. She isn't out of breath, but she feels she has to catch it. She isn't dizzy, but she needs everything to stop spinning. She isn't jet-lagged, has never been jet-lagged, but she feels like daylight savings has just happened and that she's flown across the Atlantic to boot. Her room looks nothing like her anymore. It's a reflection of a past self. On the wall above the bed are taped up pictures of an androgynous Johnny Depp torn out of the teen magazines she would buy. Until recently, he was the one exception to her disinterest in men. But when she found out he was an abusive asshole, she had to let him go, not without regret. Beside Johnny are pictures of women. Uma Thurman in Kill Bill, Gwen Stefani in her most punk No Doubt phase, Janet Jackson pre-Justin Timberlake Super Bowl. There's a hole in the center of Gwen's picture from where the poster was ripped out of the magazine, cutting off her cocked hip. "Don't you want to take those down already?" her mother had asked the last time Maggie visited. "It's been long enough, almost a decade." At the time, Maggie had tightened up, had answered something sarcastic or glib or possibly mean. She can't remember, but she knows her mother thought it was silly that this room remain a shrine to her teenage self. Maggie didn't know how to explain that she found comfort in her unchanging room. She liked the teenager she'd been, the raw newness of discovering her desires, the things that made her angry, the causes she became passionate about. She doesn't think high school was her happiest time, and she's pretty suspicious of anyone who thinks it should be, but she knows she was more open then, more willing to extend herself. Everything else shifts, changes, moves, grows up, and dies, she thinks now. So why not keep one thing the same, especially if it isn't hurting anyone? She takes a deep breath and lets herself sink back, her Conversed feet still on the floor. Just for a moment, she thinks, and shuts her eyes.
Thank you so much, Ilana. That was really great. So I have one more question before I open it up to the team and anyone who wants to put questions in the chat. So a major plot point of the book is that Maggie's mother, Iris, never fully accepted Maggie's sexuality. And they never really got to resolve that before Iris died. And so we can see this difficulty that Maggie has throughout the book between grieving over her mother's death and also resenting her for not being more supportive. Can you talk a bit about how Maggie grapples with this issue and the general discourse in this book about having a parent who has trouble accepting their child's sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, Maggie's angry at her mom for most of the book. I think she sort of goes in and out of grieving for the loss of all of the things they'll never talk about and never work through, and just being really pissed off that her mother couldn't accept the daughter she had, not, you know, the daughter she maybe thinks that her mother wished she had or thinks that her mother wanted to have. And I think that for Maggie, part of that is a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of what it was that her mother didn't accept, or why her mother didn't accept, which is not always the case, of course, for people whose parents don't accept their sexuality. But I think that for Maggie and Iris in particular, one of their problems is that they're similar in certain ways, and they're both stubborn. And so they had a hard time sort of talking to each other rather than past each other. And one of the things that I really wanted to look at in the book is the ways in which we do often talk past each other. And I think that this is sort of a common thing when we talk across generations, when we talk across assumptions we have about one another. We see other people through our assumptions about them. And Maggie sees certain things in her mother that she assumes about her mother. And so she reads her mother's understanding of her through that lens. And that sort of screws her up and screws up their relationship. But it's not one-sided, of course, right? I mean, they're both responsible for that. And I think that part of, as the book goes on, part of what she starts to learn is that she didn't know her mother nearly as well as she thought she did. And that's sort of one of the difficulties of growing up in general, right? Is sort of needing to accept that our parents are people who are more complex than maybe we think they are as their children.
Right. And you explore that very deftly. It's very difficult to explore a kind of mother-daughter relationship that's so, between people so actually similar, but in their heads they're so different. So I thought that was really well explored.
Well, thank you. I'm glad.
Yeah. Does anybody from the team have a question for Ilana?
Hi, I'm Carol. I noticed, as did several of the rest of us readers, that food plays a really important role in your book, whether it's the Shiva food or the fast food of various ethnic varieties that provide sort of stopovers in both Maggie's travels and Ariel's travels. And there's always fast food around, or Indian food or Mexican food. Can you talk a little bit about what food meant to you in the book?
I'm laughing only because I'm sort of the farthest thing from a foodie imaginable. And so I actually had to look up I had to do a lot of research about food to sort of know what I was talking about. But Maggie is a lot more of a foodie than I am, and Iris certainly is a foodie. And so that was one of the connections that I wanted to draw between them that they weren't necessarily always aware of. Again, right? One of these parallels that they have. And also just in thinking about the California landscape, right? California is such a sort of diverse place in terms of its culinary experiences, right? I mean, from the sort of pleasure and obsession people take with In-N-Out Burger, that is such a big part of what it means to live in California, for certain people, to the kind of out of the way, hole in the wall places that people love to discover and make much of, to, you know, now the natty wine scene, which isn't in the book. There's just a lot of news about it right now for some reason. So I've been thinking about it. So I was thinking about food as sort of a way that people make connections, and more tacitly, food is, you know, something that I think many people across cultures tend to connect over, right? Like, here, come get to know my culture through my food, or I will get to know your culture through your food. And so I was thinking about it sort of in that way as well.
One of the things that struck me, sort of going off of that, is how you talk about race and how that's sort of intertwined into the novel. One thing I thought, just pulling out a quote, is that Maggie says, she's white after all, Jewish-ish, queer, yes, but still white. I wondered, and she's especially comparing herself to her girlfriend's situation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you address race and sexuality and the intersection in your novel.
Absolutely, and thank you for asking that. I haven't been asked that a ton by interviewers in general yet, so I'm pleased when people do address that, because white authors don't get asked about race that much, which I think is interesting. So I think about whiteness a lot, and I think that this is something that is also a generational divide, especially for people who are Jewish, in this country specifically, because I know that when I have conversations with my mother and aunt, they think about their whiteness in a different way than I do, partially because of how when they were growing up, being Jewish was still very different than what it is today. And it felt very different, and it felt a lot more othered still than it feels today, in a way that was more clear to them than maybe it was for many people my age or your age, when we were growing up. I mean, even of course now we see a lot of sort of anti-Semitic attacks, so it's not like it's something that doesn't exist right now. But I think that for a lot of millennials anyway, there is sort of an attempt to grapple with what white supremacy means in this country, and sort of grapple with the idea of whiteness and what our responsibility is as people who are white and who benefit from white privilege. And so for Maggie, there are moments when she's very aware of her whiteness. There are moments when she isn't aware of her whiteness. And her girlfriend, Lucia, is of Puerto Rican descent. She's an Afro-Latina, and her sort of lived experience in the world is different than Maggie's. And there are moments when Maggie is aware of that, and moments when she's not aware of that. And those are, sometimes more obvious on the page than not, I think. It might be more obvious to some readers than not. But I wanted to sort of look at those spaces where Maggie is more or less aware of that, because that is part of the millennial experience. For some people, I think for a lot of queer people who, and I don't love this term, but for lack of a better term, woke, right? People were trying to think about their political embodiment or space. And also as a queer woman, right? Like her positionality is different. She's in a lot less danger in certain ways than her girlfriend is, right? So when they're walking down the street hand in hand, she might not think of it as a political act, but for her girlfriend, it might be, depending on the space they're in, depending on who's around them. So I was thinking about the ways in which she is and is not thinking about this, and just trying to sort of look at that as different than how Iris considers her own whiteness and her own Jewish identity in space.
So Evie actually has a great question, but her internet's being a little funny, so I'm going to ask for her. So she wanted to know, you talk a little bit about performative grieving as your main character and her brother deal with grief differently on social media. Can you talk a little bit about that and about grieving in the public space now, especially when we see so many people who can't grieve normally, things like Zoom Shivas, things like that?
Yeah, I didn't even make that connection. Wow, that's true, because we are doing that now, aren't we? Yeah, I think that part about performative grief, I was thinking about it sort of as related somewhat to my own experience of various spaces I've been in where I've seen people need to perform grief in certain ways or expected to perform grief in certain ways. And then people who sort of take, on the other hand, right, there are moments where Maggie feels like she's watching other people perform grief in ways that she doesn't like or doesn't appreciate, or she feels they are performing grief in ways that aren't theirs to perform. And I think that grief is just complicated and messy, and that women are often expected to, you know, pick up a particular kind of labor, of caretaking, right, in general, and she resents that. I think that she resents that in terms of the funeral portion of the book, especially. In thinking about sort of the online version of grieving, I think that that is a whole other complicated thing that, I mean, right now, when it's what we can do, I mean, it's not performative, right? I mean, it's how we can connect. It's how we're trying to connect. So I feel like when we have no ways to be in the same space as other people, it's so much better than nothing. When we're missing human contact, like words can fill so much space.
We have a lot of questions in the chat, actually, so I'm going to delve into a couple of those.
Please.
Diane Kaplan asked, do you think the book could apply to other mother-daughter relationships not related to differences in sexuality?
Absolutely, I would hope so. I mean, I think that many mother-daughter relationships are complicated and, you know, messy, and have these ways in which they miss each other and speak across each other.
Awesome. Okay. Judy asked, structurally, you've used both Shiva and the classic road trip as the framework of your book. Did you plan this from the beginning or come to it over the course of working on it? Yeah.
So the Shiva, actually, I don't think I realized that I would have that as sort of a part of the structure. But in terms of the road trip, that was when I actually knew that I had a novel with a plot on my hands, because this isn't the first novel I've written. It's just the first novel I've actually managed to sell and publish. But once I realized, like, oh, I have letters. Ooh, she can deliver them. Ooh, road trip. I was like, I have a plot, finally. And so, yeah, so the road trip I had from the beginning.
Michelle asked, did you write toward she said she didn't see the end of the novel coming, which we obviously won't give away. But did you write toward a predetermined ending, or did it evolve as you were writing?
So there's a part, yes. Yeah, so I was writing towards that ending. I didn't always know that ending, but I knew the ending quite early in the process of sort of figuring out these characters. And again, the ending didn't really come to me as an ending, as it were. It came to me as sort of things that I found out about the characters as I was doing a lot of pre-writing. And once I sort of knew more about the characters and figured out what I was writing towards, it helped me very much to shape the plot and sort of figure out, oh, this is what I can move toward. And that very much helped me in terms of how I structured the book.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I have a question for you. How much is, if she is at all, how much is Maggie's character based on you?
Very, very little. Maggie is a lot cooler than me. Maggie has like all this game that I do not have. You know, like Maggie is the kind of person that I would see at a bar or at a cafe and I would just look at and be like, ooh, she's real hot, and I will never be able to like go up and talk to her. I'm super intimidated. No, Maggie is not very much based on me at all.
That is surprising. I thought, I don't know, she was just such like a very bold character. Like I feel like she would have been based on someone real, but you wrote her so well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions from the team?
I'll ask a question. You already talked about mother-daughter relationships, but what about mother-father and sibling relationships? I mean, both of those are very interesting in the book, not to give anything away, but talking about a little bit about both of those relationships.
So, yeah, so again, sort of there's not any sort of straight autobiographical stuff in there in terms of if it's based on. The sibling relationship, I think I had a lot of fun writing because my brother and I are not like that at all. Like not at all. But I have seen siblings who are like this. I know siblings who are like this, and I always find them kind of fascinating. Siblings who just sort of needle each other endlessly in a way that is both actually truly mean, but also there's this deep love underneath that meanness. And I wanted to look at that because I find it so interesting how people can be really mean to each other while there's also all of this love underneath it. Because I don't know how to be mean to people. It's not something I know. I mean, it's not something I find fun or interesting, but I'm interested in people who enjoy being mean to people as a form of interactive, combative something. So I was trying to sort of have fun with that.
And father?
And the father, so the father, I think actually, if there's anyone in the book who's somewhat based on someone, I mean, he's not based on, but in the acknowledgements, I call my partner my Peter. And he's not based on my partner, but my partner does embody in certain ways a lot of the very nurturing, caretaking aspects of Peter in the book. And I think that there are a lot more men like this than we see, or that we, are exposed to in literature often, or in pop culture. And so I wanted to write one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking of the acknowledgements, we noticed that they are kind of record-breakingly long. Would you like to comment on your process of creating those acknowledgements? I'm laughing with you. It's like adorable.
Well, they're very sincere. Like, I mean them. I just feel very, very, very grateful. I've been, working towards having this happen for a long time. And I really do believe that it doesn't happen alone. I mean, I know that there's a cliche that writers just sit in a room alone and bang out their books on a keyboard or a typewriter, and that's just like this alone thing that happens in a dark room. And I don't buy that. I mean, yeah, the writing happens in a room alone often, but life doesn't. And I don't feel like writers could really exist in a vacuum. I mean, they'd have nothing to write about, but also, without the support of all of the people who helped us to love books or helped us to think about writing or kept us company or loved us into like continuing to live in the world, we wouldn't have books.
Unfortunately, I wish we could ask more questions, but we have run out of time. For anybody's questions in the Q&A, we will share them with Ilana, and maybe we'll hear from her soon. Thank you so much for joining us, Ilana, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Please consider buying Ilana's fantastic book and check out the links in the chat. And please join us for next week's conversation with Liel Lebovitz. Thank you so much, Ilana. This was great.
Thank you, everyone.
So interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilana.